So I like to set my books around historical landmarks, which then become almost like another character in the book.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Hahn,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is Fiona Davis. Hey, thanks for tuning in to Author Stories. I am your host, Hank Garner. You can find all of the archives of the show at hankgarner.com. And while you're there, please click on the subscribe links over in the right-hand sidebar. You can subscribe on your Android phone, your iPhone, it's Stitcher Radio. Anywhere that you listen to podcasts, you can find Author Stories. We're also on YouTube. There's a link over in the right-hand sidebar as well. And you can subscribe there and never miss an episode. Today's episode is sponsored by the AIPP, the Association of Independent Publishing Professionals. If you are an indie author and you need to build a support team to help you format your book, edit your book, get a cover designed for your book, anything that an indie author needs to get their book out there, the AIPP has a member that can help you make your book, your product, the very best it can be. If you look in the show notes at the bottom of this episode, you'll find a link to the AIPP, or go to aipponline.org/members and browse through the member library and find the professional to fill out your team. Like I said, anything that you need to make your indie publishing journey a success, there's a member there to help. It's a very simple website, very easy to navigate through. Go check out aipponline.org/members today and fill out your indie author team. At the end of the show, be sure to stick around for an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Thanks for listening. He enlisted for the money. He stayed for the girl. Gateway to the Galaxy, the new series everyone is talking about, beginning with Book 1, Into the Breach. Frank and Marine Space Corps 1 find themselves across the galaxy in a WWE smackdown with the legions of a boss-level villain. But the party's just getting started. He donned the mantle of a celestial knight to impress a girl, well, an empress. Now destiny's calling in a debt. A lightning-paced military fantasy full of outlandish comedy and impossible situations that will have you hailing for these Marines from the get-go. For fans of Green Lantern and the Stargate universe, listen to what some readers are saying. This is good stuff. Thanks for the new obsession. I recommend and can't wait for the next book. And the visual pictures and action are amazing. They're getting the band back together. And this time, it's serious nonsense. Pick up the Gateway to the Galaxy series by Jonathan Yanez and J.R. Castle, available now on Amazon.com. There's a link to it in the show notes. Gateway to the Galaxy. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have a return visit from Fiona Davis with me today. Fiona has a brand new book, and it is out today, and it's called The Masterpiece. And if you loved The Dollhouse, you're going to absolutely love this book, or The Address. It is classic Fiona Davis. Welcome back to the show, Fiona.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to death.
Oh, I'm excited to have you back, Fiona. I was just looking, and we did not plan this in any way, but you were on episode 237 last year, and this episode is 436. So we are right at 200 episodes, and we couldn't even have have done that if we'd have tried. So anyway, it's awesome.
I love it. The symmetry pleases me. Yeah.
Me too. It makes my OCD just tingle a little bit, but in a happy way. Well, since you were on last, we talked about your book, The Address, last time. What has happened with The Address since then? And then let's get into the new book. But it's been a while since we talked, and The Address was just coming out. How was that book received? And were you excited to start this new one?
Yeah, sure. So I couldn't have been happier with the reception for The Address. It got some wonderful critical reviews. It became a national bestseller, which was very exciting. And it just, it just brought in this more readers who are really passionate about historical fiction and history. And it was wonderful because then they could go back and read The Dollhouse, the first book. And it just feels like we're creating this really fun wave of novels.
Exactly. There have been a lot of really great stuff going on with historical fiction over the last couple of years, and I like how you put it. There's this wave of people getting interested in history again, and getting interested in finding out about our collective past, and I just really love it.
Yeah, I agree. I think people want to know, especially when times are tenuous and there's a lot of turmoil, people want to go back and see, all right, did this happen before, and what was that like, and how is it different, and how is it the same? And I think that's what's drawing a lot of people into the genre.
Yeah, absolutely. So for people that may not have listened to that show 200 shows ago, tell us, give the listeners, I started to say readers, they're all readers too, but give the listeners a little recap about what, about these types of books that you write. They're all focused on a single place, but span time. And, kind of give a refresher on what it is that you do that is so unique in these books that you write.
Sure. So I like to set my books around historical landmarks, which then become almost like another character in the book. In my first book, The Dollhouse, it was the Barbizon Hotel for Women. There were 2 time periods and an element of mystery that connected them. And so for my second book, I turned to another New York landmark, the Dakota Apartment House. And again, I chose 2 time periods, 1884 and 1985. With 2 stories that seem completely different, but then as the story goes on, start to connect in surprising ways. And so that's what I did again for book number 3. I just love finding about the history of places. And I think I love the way that buildings reflect the way the city has changed over time. And for me, that's a really fun thing to explore in terms of how the city is changing and how that's reflected in the building that I'm focused on.
Right. And the setting for the new book is Grand Central Station, but not just Grand Central Station. You really get us into this very specific area. What is this area, and how did you discover it?
Well, when where people live, and here we're talking about a transportation hub,
right.
And I thought it might be a little dry, but I did what I normally do. Is I started doing some research, and I discovered that there's a lot of surprising things about Grand Central. One is that, for example, there was a CBS television studio there in the 1960s, I believe, where they taped all kinds of shows. And what really struck me was that there was an art school there. It was called the Grand Central School of Art. It was co-founded by John Singer Sargent, the famous painter, in the 1920s. And it had 900 students a year and ran for 20 years.
Wow.
And I haven't been able to find one person who I say, oh, did you know there was an art school at Grand Central, who said yes. And I thought, okay, that's something really interesting because it's this beautiful gem that's been lost to history, and I can bring that out. And I went through and searched for it in the New York Times archives, and they had this wonderful article describing these students running across the concourse in fancy dress, going to the masquerade ball that they'd hold every year at the art school. And I just thought, oh, that's something I can play with. So that's the one of the main settings.
Wow. What time periods did you choose for this story?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I wanted to use time periods I hadn't used before.
Okay.
To really stretch myself. And the 1920s made a lot of sense because that's, when the school was in the art world at that really heady stage during the Jazz Age right before the Depression hit. And because it really was a world in flux at that point. And so that's one of the time periods. And the other one is the 1970s, because that was, again, this pivotal moment for Grand Central Terminal. The city was almost bankrupt. The terminal was dark and dirty and very dangerous, which is hard to imagine today. And they were, in fact, fighting to preserve its landmark status because some developers wanted to put a 55-story cement building on top of it.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, and Jackie O stepped in to save the day, and so that to me was some great drama that I could use. So it goes back and forth between those two periods.
Wow. The 1920s, from our vantage point, seemed to be very glamorous, and we kind of think of F. Scott Fitzgerald and things like that. And the 1970s give an entirely different vibe. You think back to all of the horrible fashion and everything like that of the 1970s. And what a great juxtaposition these two time periods provide, the great contrast. And did the time periods and the circumstances of those time periods offer great emotional contrast for telling a story here?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think they did. I really do, because in the 1920s, everybody thought it was just this era of consuming and partying and enjoying life and, getting richer and richer. And then, of course, the 1970s is the complete opposite. You had terrible inflation. You had gas shortages. Especially in New York City, it was just falling apart, and there was no money to pay for basic services. And so I loved that contrast. And you're right, like the fashions, you had bell-bottom jeans versus drop-waisted silk gowns. That's awesome.
Silk gowns versus polyester. And
Yeah, exactly. And bob haircuts versus shag.
Right.
Shags, right?
Exactly. I think I remember, because you teased this book just a little bit at the end of our last conversation, and I think you told me that you got the idea for the setting for this book from a reader, where you had a Q&A or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So I was doing an author talk in Westchester, and a reader came up to me after and said that if I wanted, she could get me on this great behind-the-scenes tour of Grand Central. And I said, sure, why not? And I showed up, and we were given hard hats, and we tagged along with a group of architectural students. And so we got this incredible tour. We went up on the catwalks that crossed the enormous arched windows on the east side. We went all the way down below the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, where there's an abandoned train car that was said to have belonged to FDR. We really got this wonderful tour. And it was, that really sparked my imagination. So I thank her in the author's note for the idea.
Nice. How long did it take before the story started emerging? You're palling around with these architectural students, and I would imagine any number of stories would present themselves when you're going places that other people don't normally get to go. You're seeing things from a completely different vantage point than most commuters get to see. And I'm always fascinated by good story ideas. I think as writers, we're surrounded by story ideas all the time. And, any good writer can just pick one out of the air and make something out of it. But then there are those ideas that are a little more than that. They're going to be special when they arrive. At what point during the research for this did the idea for this story come to you?
Oh, it's so interesting because for me, it actually begins with the characters. And so once I have a character in mind, the plot unfolds from there. And so what I did, for during the tour, we learned about the information booth, which is right in the middle of the concourse. And I thought, oh, how interesting to have someone who works there. And then I thought, well, what if this person is like an Upper East Side socialite who's fallen on hard times and has to take a job in the clerk's booth? That kind of raises the stakes. And then I learned about this art school, and I thought, well, what if she wandered into this abandoned art school and discovered something? And suddenly her storyline is taking off. And for the 1920s section, I was doing a lot of reading about some of the artists who worked at the Grand Central School of Art and taught art there. And that was interesting because it was the first time that it was real people inspired the characters. The characters aren't the actual artists, but the actual artists led such fascinating lives that I thought I could tap into that and use that for inspiration.
That is a little different because in your other books, you've taken this place and then imagined the lives that happened inside the walls there and the stories that the walls could tell, almost, if you will. And this one, you're actually taking some real things and altering them and making some story out of that. That's was that a different process for you? Did you feel that it was different approaching it that way?
It did, and I think part of it was the fact that we're setting it at this art school, and I don't know a lot about art, and so I knew I had to do a lot of research. And the two people who inspired me were Arshil Gorky, who is this abstract expressionist painter who had led this really incredible life. It was pretty tragic, but very interesting. And so, using him as a jumping off point was helpful. And then the other person actually came to me because I interviewed an architect historian. And he said to me, if you're looking at the Grand Central School of Art, you need to look up this woman named Helen Dryden. And I did, and there's not a lot on her. But she was this amazing illustrator who did a lot of covers for Vogue magazine and went on to have this amazing career and then disappeared and then showed up in a welfare hotel. It just was this incredible up and down. And I like the idea of this woman who's this illustrator who's trying very hard to break into a man's world and fighting her way in, and which is what Helen Dryden did. So my character is inspired by her life, and kind of butts heads with the other male painter. And, sparks fly and the story moves on from there.
You don't think of magazine covers being illustrated anymore. Everything is photography, and it's probably much quicker to produce, and the dynamic range and all of that good stuff. And the only if you see a magazine cover now that's illustrated, it's usually a parody or something like that. But that's really where the cutting edge art was at the time. If you wanted to display something, you had to draw it, and you had to find new ways and innovative ways to do that. I would imagine these people were the cutting edge artists of the time.
Yes, exactly. And she had the artist Helen Dryden had a very hard time breaking into Vogue, and she finally did when they changed management, because her drawings are really stylized, It's women with very long necks, and they're enveloped in furs and, walking Dalmatians. They're absolute works of art, and they were all done by watercolor. And as part of my research, I took one of her covers and tried to recreate it, and I am not an artist. But I do have to say it came out better than I expected. And it was just so much fun to see how difficult it is, because if you mix two wet colors, you create this cauliflower effect in the painting, and you have to wait until one is completely dry before you do it. And just the way the kind of the density of the color changes depending on how much water you add. And I really enjoyed doing that just as a way to feel what that character did and be frustrated and then be proud. And that was a lot of fun.
I'll bet. When I got my advance copy of the book and started reading it, which was a couple of months ago, I think, when I realized what the story was about, I wondered, because you and I talked about your history on and off Broadway, and that you are an actor, and that you spent quite a bit of time pursuing that career path. When you're talking about an art school and art students, was there any sort of personal connection when you were kind of digging into these characters and began telling the story? Did you feel a kinship with your history as you were writing this?
I feel like artists, I'm not a natural artist by any means. I can copy something pretty well, but the idea that you sit down and you create something on a blank piece of paper, to me, is just beyond anything. And so I did a lot of research to really be able to connect to what that was like. And I interviewed curators and illustrators and fine artists, just so that I could feel like I could, find my way in there. Because to be honest, it really didn't feel like something I could access just by, being an artistic type of person. It's so tactile, and it's really obvious if it's a good piece of art or a bad one, at least in my case.
Yeah, when you finish an illustration, there's no room to improvise after that. If you're on stage and you get in a pickle, you can act your way out of it a lot of times. But
and also the next day, then the curtain comes down, and the next day you get to do it all over again. You can't do that with a painting. Right.
That's it. That's what it's going to be forever, and you'll forever be judged on this one performance. And wow, what a terrified. The more I talk about it, the more terrified I am. It's so crazy, so crazy. The main characters in this book, you begin with a character. How do they? Because we're telling the dual timeline story. Do these stories intersect ever?
Yes, they do. And hopefully it's a surprise in the way that they do. And I like that, in the 1970s, this woman has stumbled into this art school and found this painting, and she wants to find out who painted it. And it could be one of two people, and she is trying to track that down and find out more about it, find out if it's valuable, because that would be a good thing for her. And then in the other story, you have this woman who's really striving to make her mark and has a terrible personal tragedy and has to figure out what to do next. And the two worlds do collide in a way that I will not give out.
Well, we won't make you. We won't make you. That's why everybody needs to get their copy and dig into it so they can get the surprise for themselves. Your last two books, The Address and The Dollhouse, really focused on buildings that people were making their home, at least for shorter periods of time, sometimes for longer. But this was a place of refuge for people, if you will. The masterpiece, taking place in Grand Central Terminal, is by nature more transient. People are coming and going constantly. The art school is there, and people are coming there for that. But the surroundings are completely transient. Did that affect the writing of the story at all?
I thought it would. I was worried about that. But the more I got to know the building and the terminal, the more I realized it in fact opened up a lot of opportunities for me, because you have, for example, the Oyster Bar restaurant, which was around in the 20s as well as the 70s. And, so you have this marvelous restaurant to use as a setting. You have the Whispering Gallery, where if you stand in one corner and whisper, it'll transfer up the arc and then over to the other corner. Again, that's a fun place to be able to use in the book. The Grand Concourse, of course, is gorgeous. You have the Campbell apartment, which in the 1920s was the office of this businessman named John Campbell, who had this thing for Italian Renaissance decor and basically created this enormous room. It's kind of tucked away up almost a hidden staircase. But it's this enormous room that when you walk into it, it's like you're walking into a Italian palazzo from the Middle Ages. It's, wooden beams, leaded glass windows. He even had a balcony with a pipe organ for when he entertained. And it turns out that in the 1970s, that building was used as a police holding cell. They covered it up in paneling, they dropped the ceilings, and you'd never know what was hidden underneath its walls. And so suddenly you have all these really fun places to plant a scene, even more so than if it were a residence. So in the end, I think it gave me more freedom and more opportunities, which was a surprise.
And people are creatures of habit, and it's rare that someone would come to one of these places one time, unless you're a tourist or something. But people that are traveling there every day probably find these nooks and crannies that become a piece of home to them. That's part of their daily routines that they come back to over and over again. And I would imagine that begins to have the same kind of permanent feeling that writing in an apartment building might.
Yeah, I think it does. I can't tell you how many people have said to me, "Oh, your new book's at Grand Central. I, commuted through there for 5 years, or I commute through there every day." And they have a real strong connection with the building. It really feels like it's their personal portal between work and home. And so I think that's absolutely wonderful.
Why do you think that these places, these buildings that are just stone and steel and glass and wood, why do they resonate so deeply with us, do you think? You've kind of uncovered these things over and over in your books, that these places become part of who we are. Yeah,
it's like there's these hidden stories in all these buildings, almost like ghosts are walking around and wanting to have their story told. And I feel that I'm just the conduit to, come up with these stories and get them out there. I think people, I mean, for me at least, because we traveled so much as a kid in England, we'd go back and visit all our relatives there. My parents would take us to castles and ruins and estates so that my brother and I didn't kill each other in the car during the drive. It would kind of break up the journey. And I was so amazed. I mean, there, if a building is less than 800 years old, it means it's pretty new. And so the history of a place just sunk into my bones and in my blood of, wow, what was it like for a servant here, 1,500 years ago? What was it like for a servant here 100 years ago? What was it like for the royalty or the lady of the manor? And I think that's pretty much where it came from. The idea that our timeline that we have right now is really just a small sliver of time, and there's so much else that has happened, and that there are echoes throughout history as events and things keep on happening over and over.
Right. We talk about these pieces of architecture, which is art on a grand scale, I guess you could look at it. But in this story, we're also talking about artists in training and artists in vocation, and how the art, their personal production, their personal expression of art is affecting them and the people around them. Did you learn anything about art and artist in researching this book and writing it that maybe stood out to you about why it is that these things affect us the way they do and mean so much to us?
Yeah, I just the struggle to be an artist in America is, just as it was 100 years ago, it still is really, really hard to be an artist. And there's some really amazing ones out there doing great work. And I think, I think it's underappreciated these days in the world of Netflix and, that kind of thing, where you get this easy entertainment. To really look and study a painting is hard, and it takes work, and it takes giving yourself a background in what it means and why is this painting important. And I certainly am far from an expert, but I really respect the process and just how hard it is.
There's another great undercurrent in the story is the place of women and their the struggles that they have to be accepted in the and we talked about it a little earlier with it being very much a man's world in the advertising and the magazine business there. What did well, first off, how did that affect you when you started kind of looking into what was going on and maybe the industries at the time? And was it difficult to get in that mindset, being that we, of course, we still have lots of work to do even in 2018, but I would hope that we're far better than we were maybe in the 20s and 30s. What was that like for you telling those stories?
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough when you go back and see how someone as talented as, say, Helen Dryden was, really didn't get her due until she really had to push through a glass ceiling there. And I can only imagine her frustration. And so it's interesting to capture that, because I think it's smart to look back and go, wow, boy, we've come far. Now, you could apply to do covers for The New Yorker. If you were a man or a woman, it wouldn't matter. But at the same time, I do think there's still a ways to go. And so bringing to light the injustices of the past is very important.
Sometimes looking at the injustices of the past kind of show us how much work we still have yet to do.
True, that's true.
Yeah, maybe we think that we've come a whole lot farther than we have until you start really putting a name and face on it, and you say, "Gosh, we really are not as great as we think we are."
Right, right. There, I know. I was just reading about the pay inequity at the BBC and in the New Yorker, and it's just amazing how things are still. It's still an uphill battle.
Yeah. When you are tackling a story like this on such a grand scale, how do you know when the story is done? Is it all about the character and their personal arc? Is it that the place has fulfilled a purpose in these characters in this particular arc? How do you know when this story is done and it's safe to move on?
I think, I'm a real plotter, so I figure out who the characters are, and then I plot their stories pretty with a lot of detail. And so I know what each of their story arc will be. I know how the stories will mix in and out of each other. And I know the general, idea of the mystery element is very important to me. I want the readers to keep on turning the page to find out, wait, what happened? What's the mystery? What's the answer to it? And so because of that, I have to be very careful that I'm not dropping clues in one place when I, need to save them for later. So yeah, it can be pretty hard because there's so many threads that you want to weave together in a tapestry that is, makes sense and is logical. And And so for me, I'll do a first draft and then go back and start layering in more detail and deepen the characterizations and deepen the sense of place. So I tend to know when the story will end and what it is, but then I build on it in layers and just add in more things. So it grows kind of up rather than out.
Right.
If that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Fiona, the new book is out. The masterpiece is out today when people are hearing this. Are you working on another one while we're reading the masterpiece?
Yes, I am. I'm very happily working on a book that's set at the Chelsea Hotel.
Oh, nice.
Which is another New York City landmark building. It's still there today. It's on 23rd Street, and there's a real a haven for artists and of all kinds. So you had lots of people lived there. Bob Dylan, Dylan Thomas. It's quite an amazing haven for people who became very famous. And but that takes place during the McCarthy era, so the 1950s, and it really deals with theater and a playwright, and it's been a lot of fun. I'm enjoying it immensely, but I'm very excited to get the masterpiece out in the world today.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to send everybody to go get their copy of the masterpiece and the dollhouse and the address if they have not read those yet. We're going to put links to all of those in the show notes of today's episode at hankgarner.com. Fiona, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me anytime.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Mather steepled his hands. "You asked to join us once?" Hedwig leaned forward, eagerly. "The Appointed. Does that appeal?" "Yes." "Do you even know what we do?" "My grandmother used to say that you control the world. That's not far off. But why? To what end?" "I don't know. Power?" "Pour me a bourbon." Mather reached into his briefcase and produced a file folder. "I want to tell you one story. Have you ever heard of Centralia, Pennsylvania?" "No." He produced a photo for Hedwig's inspection. Spring of 1962. A pretty little town, wasn't it? Whitewash and ticky-tacky, pastel housewives and perfect lawns. A mining community, mostly. Coal. He turned over a second photo. A lovely young woman. There was a single witch in Centralia named Anna Lively. Anna had a green thumb. She could make her garden grow, whisper to a flower, and send it shooting from the ground like that. Just lovely. But she was discovered. That spring, a boy named Bobby Avery received a Bell & Howell Zoomatic movie camera for his 11th birthday. Bobby amused himself by filming his neighbors, sometimes without their knowledge, through windows and over garden fences. 12 seconds of film. Just a girl and her garden patch, and one swiftly blooming rose. It killed the town. Bobby showed it to his friends. Children believe readily. Bobby was the first to die. Parents looked into it, watched the film themselves, and they began to die. Anna disappeared. Perhaps they attacked her. Perhaps she escaped. But even in her absence, knowledge of a true witch was running wild through the population, as if Anna had beckoned it herself to grow verdant and spread. The great curse had killed 64 Centralians by the 1st of June. The footage was offered to a national news organization. That was the precipice. It might have been shown in prime time, between Leave It to Beaver and My Three Sons. We came very close to another worldwide calamity, but we were fortunate. One of our own was in place at the network. He alerted his superiors, and they ended the situation. Do you know how? I'm afraid to ask. Mather laid down another photo. This is Centralia today. It was an aerial view of a forest. Endless trees and underbrush cut through by lanes of pavement. Just a maze of cracking asphalt, like the foundations of Sodom, ripped bare by the wrath of God. Only a cemetery remained, on a hill overlooking the former town. A white marble angel stood among the graves, grieving for the ruins below, like Lot's wife, turned to salt. You destroyed the whole town? Not I. This was well before my time. But, yes. Just as you'd cauterize a wound to stop a patient from bleeding to death. We blamed it on an uncontrollable mine fire, deep below the earth. We actually set the coal burning, in case someone investigated. It burns today. Touch any of those streets and you'll find them hot, the asphalt melting as if the town sat just above perdition. It's not something we're proud of, but it was necessary to save the world. Centralia, Pennsylvania, and everyone who'd seen that film had to be sacrificed. Mather collected the photos. So, that is why the appointed exist, and that is what we do. Still want to join?